Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here. This time around, we're going to do some troubleshooting and problem solving for our Nikon Z series cameras. The thing is, I noticed that I get the same kind of problems and questions about the Z cameras over and over again, and I see it in my email, I see it on the BCG forums. In fact, I see it to such an extent that I actually, about a year or so ago, added a special chapter in the back of my Z8, Z9 setup guide that just had all these common troubleshooting questions in there so people could figure out what the heck was going on with their cameras. And of course, I added that to my new Z6 III guide as well. But I thought YouTube would be a great place to share some of this stuff because sometimes it's easier just to see how it is fixed, just watching a video. So that's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna give you the most common problems that I run across and I hear people running across with the Z series camera in this video. And one quick thing to keep in mind is that this is primarily going to focus on the Z8, Z9, Z6 III, the more modern Nikon Z series cameras. However, a lot of this stuff is still going to apply to the older cameras. So if you're having a problem and you see a question and answer here, it's probably going to apply to like your Z6, Z6 II, Z7, Z7 II, etc., etc. So, definitely watch the video and take a look at that. And speaking of watching the video, I realize that if you're here looking for the solution to a problem, I encourage you to look at the chapters, get to the problem that you're having and fix it. But I also encourage you just to watch the whole video because one of these times you're going to have one of these problems, or you're going to have all these problems eventually, I think. And one of these times you're going to be like, oh, how am I going to fix that? And if you know the solution beforehand, it makes it much faster to go to your camera and get it straightened out. Or if nothing else, make sure you save, like, favor, bookmark, whatever you need to do to this video so you can reference it later. But preamble out of the way, let's jump into our first problem and solution. I've set my camera for RAW, but right now it's only shooting JPEGs. I even went to the image quality menu under the photo shooting menu, and that's grayed out, so I can't even change it there. What's happening? This is a pretty common one, and most of the time it's just because you have the wrong frame rate in there. You're using one of the high-speed capture frame rates, one with a little C in front of it, and if you go back to your normal frame rate, everything will work. Let me show you. So we have our camera here. Just press the release mode button here, and as you go through, you can see right now I'm in just normal continuous high, so I would be able to shoot RAW. However, if I go over here, you can see that it says C30. Anything with the letter C in front of it, C30, 60, 120, C15 in the Z9, anything that has a C in front of it is a high-speed capture frame rate, and what that means is the camera is going to shoot some sort of JPEG using that, and there's no option for RAW if your frame rate is set to one of those options. And the type of JPEG it shoots varies by frame rate, so I have all that covered in my books, but regardless, if you want to get back to shooting RAW, all you have to do is go back to something like continuous high, continuous low, and no problem, you'll be back to shooting RAW just like you should be. And that menu that was grayed out, that'll be available to you again. My rear LCD won't turn on when I pull my eye from the viewfinder. Another way I've heard this question phrased is my live view screen won't come on the back of the camera. Now, of course, keeping in mind that it's live view in both places because it's a feed off the sensor, but regardless, if you can't get your rear monitor to work, the solution's pretty simple. You want to look at this little button on the side of the viewfinder housing, this little tiny guy right here. That's your monitor mode selection button, and if you press that, it'll cycle through all your different options for your monitor and viewfinder priorities and displays and stuff. And what's probably happened is you've probably inadvertently brushed up against this or pressed this, and you've gone to something that prioritizes or just limits the camera to just the viewfinder, and that's why your rear LCD is not turning on. Cycling through this, pressing this a few times should get you back to normal. Most people are looking for automatic display switch, which is the one where you're looking through the viewfinder and you pull your eye away and then this turns back on. And so just cycle through until you see automatic display switch. Press this button until automatic display switch shows back up here. Just as kind of a continuation and a side note though, there are other options here, and I want to go over those really briefly with you here. I cover these in the book pretty extensively, but I think these are valuable to look at. I would show you with a better screen capture, but unfortunately my device does not work for this particular feature when it's hooked up, so we got to do it the hard way. But anyhow, under the setup menu, in the Z8, Z9, and Z6 III, you'll find an option for a limit monitor mode selection. Some of the other cameras might have this too, but this allows you to specify which display options the camera's going to cycle through when you press this little button. So you can eliminate some of these so you don't have to press it as many times to get back to shooting and get back to the modes that you want. You can eliminate the ones that are no good for you. So I'm going to give this a press. And you can see we have different options. We have automatic display switch, which we just discussed. We have viewfinder only, which will limit all your display to just the viewfinder. We have monitor only, which will be just this, no viewfinder at all. Of course, you can check and uncheck the ones you want. As you can see, I've unchecked viewfinder and monitor only because I don't ever want to just have those. Usually I want some hybrid approach, either automatic display switch as you see at the top, or one of the prioritized viewfinder options, 1 or 2. And most of the time I like prioritized viewfinder 1. Now, 1 and 2 work pretty much the same way. The way it works is, right now I have it on prioritized viewfinder 1. If you notice, my rear LCD is off. However, if I hit the menu button, it works. If I hit the playback button, I don't think there's anything there, but the little underexposed photo pops up there. So I can still use my rear LCD for playback and for menus and things like that. But when I'm shooting, it's all up here. This is not going to turn on when I move my eye away from the viewfinder. However, there's a trick to it. If I pull this out a little bit, watch what happens. It turns back on. So this way, if I'm using my rear LCD, which I usually do by pulling it out because I'm shooting low with it or something, then all I have to do is pull it out and I have it working and it's fine. On prioritized viewfinder 1 or 2. And I put it back like this and it shuts back off. Now the difference between 1 and 2, prioritized viewfinder 1 and 2, is very subtle. There's a couple of minor differences. I go over more extensively in the book, but I think the biggest one is the way it handles playback, because this really throws people off, and I'm sure you've experienced this if you've ever been on prioritized viewfinder 2. And basically, what happens in prioritized viewfinder 1, when you have that in there, you've pressed this button and you've gotten to prioritized viewfinder 1. When you're in that mode and you're reviewing an image on the back of your camera, if you look into your viewfinder, you still see that image. The image stays and you can zoom in and use the diopter corrected viewfinder to get a better look at it. However, in prioritized viewfinder 2, if you're looking at an image back here and then put your eye to the viewfinder, the camera switches back to shooting mode. And I'm sure a lot of you have run into that where you're trying to review an image and you look to the viewfinder to get a better look at it and it goes to shooting mode. It's because you're in prioritized viewfinder 2. That's why I usually like 1, but it depends on what you're concerned about at that moment. If you want to make sure that when you go back to the viewfinder, you're just ready to shoot, then prioritized viewfinder 2 is the way to go. But for me, I usually like it in prioritized viewfinder 1. And as another side note, this throws people with this too, is as you're toggling through this, pressing this little button, whatever mode you're going into, whether it's monitor only, viewfinder only, prioritized viewfinder, whatever, it's going to display that information on that screen. So if I'm going to viewfinder only, it's going to show it in there and not back here. So if you're just looking at the camera like this and you're toggling through, you might not realize what you're doing. You have to kind of look in both places. So most of the time I just recommend people look right through the viewfinder there. So at any rate, hopefully that helps. I set up a grid overlay for my viewfinder or rear LCD, but it's not showing up anywhere, even when I cycle through my displays. This is a problem more for the Z8, Z9, Z6 III. The newer Nikons, basically, are going to probably have this. Most of them are going to have this. It's hard to say because I don't know what future models are going to do. But regardless, we're seeing this with the newer Nikons. And basically what Nikon's done is they let you set up a grid, but they don't have any way to turn it on or off directly like they did with their older cameras. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. So you go into shooting and display here. And you go over to grid type, and you can go in here and you can select all these different grid types, right? You have 3x3, 4x4, whatever you want. I like the 3x3 one just for reference. But there's not an on and off switch here. So when you set that and you click it in there, you assume that when you look in your viewfinder or on your rear LCD, you're going to see that grid, but you don't. So how do you fix that? Well, with the Z8, Z9, Z6 III, these other cameras, you actually have to go down to custom monitor shooting display or custom viewfinder shooting display. I'm going to use that one since most of the time people want this in their viewfinder, but it works exactly the same if you want it on your rear LCD on the monitor back here. So we're going to give that a click. And then we're going to tell the camera that we want to have that grid display on our viewfinder. And you can see I have it turned on right now. And as a side note, you'll notice that there's display 1, 2, 3, 4. These are what you cycle through when you press the display button if you have it set for display. And I have a couple of them shut off because I don't use all of them. I only use a couple of them here. And I go over all of this in detail in the book if you're if you want some more information on it. But basically what we're trying to do here is just turn the grid on. So I'm going to press the right-hand side of my multi-selector, and that is going to bring me into a submenu where I can select what is displayed on that particular display. In this case, display 1, and again, we access that with our display button. And I'm going to go down here and just make sure that the framing grid is checked. By default, it's not. So if it's not, you can see that that little example grid turns off on our screen here. And I give it another click, and then the framing grid comes back on. And that's what you want. So if you want your grid, you have to come in here and set it. And when you're done, just hit the menu button, and you're all set. Now, if you want to add that to multiple displays, you can do so. You can come in here like display 2. I don't have it turned on. I like just kind of a very plain display as my alternate for my viewfinder. But if I wanted to put that grid on, I could come down here, give it a click, turn it on, and that's all there is to it. Very, very easy. And again, it works exactly the same for the monitor. But if you're trying to get your grid to work and you're not having any luck, this is what you need to do. Pretty easy. My histogram isn't showing up anywhere and I don't know how to get it back. This is a pretty common problem, and there's about 3 different primary reasons that this will happen. Now, the first one is basically either the display itself doesn't include the histogram or you haven't turned the histogram on for that display. It depends on your camera. For older cameras, we couldn't customize our displays, so the histogram was basically kind of built into one of the displays. You just have to press the display button a few times until you see that histogram show up either in your viewfinder or on your rear panel, whichever one you're working with at the moment. Now, for the Z8, Z9, Z6 III, the newer Nikons, probably the ZF2 falls into this category. For the newer cameras, you need to go in and go to those customized settings there that we looked at just a moment ago with the grid. So let's go back there for a minute. And this time, let's go to, instead of customize viewfinder display, let's customize our monitor shooting display. So custom monitor shooting display, give that a click. And what we want to do, now this is for the back monitor. Just like with the grid, this works exactly the same between the monitor and the viewfinder, same setup screens, everything. Well, not exactly the same screens, but you get the idea, the same system here. So let's just say we want to make sure our histogram is on for display 1. We go in here and we go down to histogram and just make sure that's checked. And that's usually the reason that you're not seeing a histogram. And you can turn the histogram on for any of the screens that you want. So if you want it on all of your screens, you can enable it on this one. I believe I have it enabled on all mine. No, I don't on this one. So I can go in here. If I wanted it on there, I can go ahead and click that. You can see it turns that histogram on for me. In this particular case, I want just a very plain screen, though. I always like to do that both with the rear panel and with the viewfinder, like a very plain screen just to kind of focus on composition sometimes. But that's how you do it there. Once you get that set, hit the menu button and you're done. And then you'll have to hit the display button to go to whichever of those screens that you set your histogram for. So for the most part, that'll take care of the problem. However, there are 2 other reasons why you might not be seeing your histogram. And the first one is ease of viewing. So we're going to go up here. And basically we have view mode, photo live view on the Z8, Z9. Newer cameras are going to call it this. Older cameras, like say a Z7 II, will say apply settings to live view and it'll be an on and off switch. But basically that's what we want to do. We want to apply our settings to live view. So we're going to go ahead and give this a click. And what we want to do is make sure that this is set to show effects of settings, or again, apply settings to live view in an older camera. Because what that's going to do is that's going to show us in the viewfinder the actual live feed. If we have it set for adjust for ease of viewing, it's going to give us kind of an idealized version of it. You could be completely, totally underexposed, but if you have it set for this, you would never see it in the viewfinder. The camera's going to show you the idealized version of it and just let you underexpose the heck out of it. So most of the time, we want to be on show effects of settings anyway. However, if you are on adjust for ease of viewing or you have apply settings to live view turned off on the older cameras, that histogram is not going to show up. So that's a first clue that maybe you're not on the setting that you think you are. So you want to make sure you come in here and make sure this is set to show effects of settings, and then your histogram will show up if it was set to something else. And we'll say always on this one. There we go. So what about that third reason? Well, it's right below here, and that is starlight view. And if we turn this on, the histogram is going to go away. If we turn it off, the histogram will show back up. So make sure that this is off if you're using like Z8, Z9, something with starlight view. I'm missing the manual focus ring and AF mode option on my focus menu under the custom setting menu. Where to go? This is a pretty common one, and it's really more of a weird user interface decision by Nikon. Basically what's happened is you've attached a lens or don't have a lens attached at all that is not got a focus ring on it. If it does not have a dedicated focus ring, not a control ring that you focus with, but rather a dedicated focus ring, you're not going to see this. If you do have a dedicated focus ring, like I do with this 24 to 120, you can see I have a dedicated focus ring, and then I have my control ring down here, but this is my dedicated focus ring. So I get this menu option, as you can see right there. However, if I were to put my 180 to 600 on, now with the 180 to 600 on, let's take a look, and look at that, it's gone. Why is that? Because even though I can manually focus my 180 to 600 with this control ring, this is not a dedicated focus ring. This is not. So it doesn't work that way. So that's what the difference here is that you have to have a dedicated focus ring. If you do, it'll show up. If you don't, it won't. So camera's not broken. As a side note, in case you're wondering what the heck this thing is for, this allows you to enable or disable the manual focus ring itself. So sometimes you might want to disable that focus ring because it's very easy to accidentally bump it and go into manual focus override mode, especially if you're like in a safari vehicle on a beanbag or something like that, and you find that the camera keeps going into manual focus override because it's so sensitive. Just shut the manual focus ring off. You don't have to worry about it. My camera hesitates a short time before taking a photo after I press the shutter release. This one is pretty easy, and it's almost universally going to be your exposure delay mode is turned on. And sometimes we can program that to a specific button. Sometimes we do it through the menu. And a lot of times we forget that it's off. In fact, if you were having this problem and watching this troubleshooting video, as soon as I said it, you were like, oh yeah, that's what I need to do. But very quickly, to turn that back off, we just jump into the menu, go to shooting and display, and under our custom settings, and we go to, sorry, got to get there. It's a lot of options here. Exposure delay mode. Give that a click. And you can see that we have options in there. If it's set to anything but off, you're going to have that brief little delay when you press the shutter release. So make sure that this is off. And by the way, this is very handy if you're doing very meticulous tripod work and you need everything to be very vibration free. So this isn't a bad setting per se. It's just that you got to remember to turn it off. When I rotate my camera from horizontal to vertical, my AF point moves, or my AF point moves and changes to a different AF area. This one's easy. This is because you have store points by orientation turned on in the custom settings menu under focus there. And I'm going to show you how to manipulate that, but let me show you exactly what's happening here. So right now you can see on the screen that I have a wide small AF area just above center here. And that's with the camera horizontal. However, if I flip the camera vertical, watch what happens. Now I have a 3D AF area, and it's starting up towards the top of the frame rather than in the middle. And if I go back, it pops back to the wide small area. Now before you go and turn this off, this can be handy. So let's say you're in a situation where you're photographing birds and maybe they're flying by and you want something like wide small or wide large as your horizontal AF area, but you're also photographing some long neck bird and you want to shoot those vertical, and you want to do that with single point or 3D. This allows you to do kind of both at the same time. So as they're flying by, I can use that wide, large area, for instance, to catch the flyers. A little bit easier than trying to get that little 3D AF area on them. And then when there's a break in the action, I can go back to photographing my other bird over here that's vertical. And when I flip the camera vertical, I then have my 3D or single point, and I can put it right on the eye, take my pictures. Oh, look, here's some flyers. Flip it to horizontal, boom, I'm right back to the other AF area. So it is an advantageous thing, but it can be very distracting. So if you want to turn this on or off or do whatever, I'm going to show you how to do that right now. We're going to go to the menu, focus under custom settings menu here, and we're looking for store points by orientation. We're going to give this a click. And we have a couple of options here on the Z8. Some cameras are just going to have focus point. So basically you're going to have one focus point. And whatever focus point that is, it's just going to go to different positions. This one also gives us, a Z8 and Z9 gives us focus point and AF area. So that means that we can actually have a different AF area in a different spot and a different position as well. And of course we can shut it off. So if you don't want it to do this at all, just go to off and it'll shut that off for you. But if you want to use this, you can turn it on either just for the focus point or just for the focus point and the AF area. And by the way, to set this up, sometimes that throws people off. Let's say you wanted to use the focus point and AF area mode. If you want to set this up, basically there's no setup. You just switch to whatever AF area and position you want when you're in vertical and when you're in horizontal, and the camera will remember it. So if I'm in horizontal right now and I'm using my wide small area, I go to vertical and it jumps to 3D. Then I go back to horizontal And then I'm back to this. If I want to change that position or that AF area, I can do so. And then when I go back to vertical, I still have 3D, and I can change that too if I want. And then when I go back here, you can see it, remember the last thing I did. It works the same way, whether you're horizontal or vertical. So that's how that whole feature works. And again, I do cover this very thoroughly in my setup guides. But for right now, if you want to just shut it off, that's where you have to do it. But I just wanted to give you a little background here too. My shutter speed is weirdly precise, so much so that it's displaying decimals. So let's take a look at the shutter speed down here. If you notice, it says 1933.1. If I roll it a little bit, it's then 1947.1. So this is a weirdly precise shutter speed, right? Well, what's happening is I have high frequency flicker reduction turned on, and that's what causes this problem. To fix it is very easy. We just go to the photo shooting menu, go to high frequency flicker reduction, turn that off. And when we go back to shooting, you can see we're at normal shutter speeds once again. My viewfinder blacks out when I press my shutter release in continuous frame advance, or I'm seeing a blackout between frames. So there's a couple of things going on here. So the first one is if you are pressing your shutter release in continuous frame advance and it's just black in the viewfinder the entire time you're doing that, that is caused by having view all in continuous turned off. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to go to the menu, shooting display, and we're looking for view all in continuous mode. We want to make sure that is turned on. If that is turned off, you're going to see that blackout every time you're pressing, and you're not going to see anything until you release. And the reason that it's there, according to Nikon, I asked them about it. Basically, the idea is if you're using the camera remotely, the camera's not using as much battery power since it's not displaying. That seems kind of like a pretty lame excuse. I don't know why this is here other than to throw people off. But just make sure that this is turned on, and that prolonged blackout you see when you're holding down your shutter release during continuous frame shooting will go away, and you'll be able to see what's happening. So very easy solution to that one. Now, the other one is if you're seeing a blackout between frames. Now, there's several reasons for this. Now, the first one is maybe your release timing indicator is set to type A, and that is right below this particular option, the view all in continuous mode option. We want to click that, and if you are on type A, that's going to deliberately put a blackout between frames. Okay, so that's the first reason you might be seeing a blackout between frames. So I like type B, but you can use type C. Type B basically puts little white lines around the entire viewfinder. They flash as you shoot. I like that one, so that's the one I use. But if you're on type A, then yeah, you're going to see a little tiny blackout between the frames. Now, the other thing we have is type A auto restore delay. Make sure that is set down to 1/6 of a second. So that's going to keep that blackout at bay for up to 1/6 of a second. Once you get to that 1/6 of a second, there's going to be a blackout between frames. It's unavoidable. But up to that point, you can actually choose to have the camera say, if you're at 1/200th of a second, show you a blackout between frames. Presumably, this is because Nikon says it's easier to do slow shutter speed panning with a blackout between frames. I do not find that true at all, so I set this down to 1/6 of a second. But if you are seeing a blackout like between 1/200th of a second and 1/6 of a second, the chances are maybe you have this set to one of those shutter speeds in here and it's showing you that blackout. So put it to 1/6 of a second, and it'll only show up when it absolutely has to, which is 1/6 of a second and slower. So that's the other one. Now, another thing that could be happening is flicker reduction. Now, I've not personally experienced this, but I have been told, and people have told me and confirmed it, that having flicker reduction on can cause a blackout between frames as well. So if we go to our photo shooting menu and go all the way down to photo flicker reduction, just make sure that that is turned off, and that might get rid of your blackout between frames. Now, one final thought on blackout between frames is sometimes if you are shooting at a smaller f-stop, you're going to see maybe a little bit of a black flash in there as the aperture stops down to the working aperture. So sometimes you do see that. That is normal. That's not like a complete blackout. It's just the aperture doing its thing and temporarily causing a little bit of reduction in light coming to the sensor there. But otherwise, those should solve any kind of blackout problems. I can't seem to get to all of my AF areas. Some are missing. So what's happening here could be a couple of things. The first thing you have to remember is that not every AF area mode is compatible with every AF mode. So for example, if you're in AFS mode, you're not going to be able to access 3D AF because that's AFC only. On the other hand, if you're in AFC mode, you're not going to be able to access something like pinpoint AF because that only works in AFS mode. So in some cases, the reason you're not able to access those AF area modes is because you're in an AF mode that just doesn't support them. Now, the other thing that happens is there's an option in the custom setting menu called Limit AF Area Mode Selection. And what happens is people set up their cameras, they stumble upon this, they maybe uncheck a few AF areas that they want, then they kind of forget that it happened because let's face it, when we're setting up a camera, there's a lot of settings and it's tough to memorize everything you've done. So let me show you where that is and what may have happened to you. So we're going to go to Menu, and we're going to go to the Focus menu, and we're looking for something called Limit AF Area Mode Selection. Once you find it, give it a click, and you'll get a list of all of your AF areas. Now, there's a little box next to one of these. You can check and uncheck the box just by hitting the OK button. But basically what this does is it allows you to specify which AF area modes you're going to have access to when you're changing your AF area modes. The idea is that if there's some AF area modes that you're not using, why do you have to cycle past them every single time you're trying to change an AF area to something else? So this allows you to uncheck the ones that you don't use. Now, if you've forgotten you've done that, or you suddenly end up needing those AF areas again, this is where you can do it. So let's say I have all my dynamics shut off and I said, oh, you know what? I did want dynamic area AF small. Give that a click and you can see it comes back on, and then I just hit the menu button and that locks it in. And now that'll show up when I'm looking for my AF areas. But it's a very handy feature, but it can throw you if you've forgotten that you've set it up. My program buttons don't seem to be working. Okay, so there's a multitude of reasons for this to happen, but I'm going to give you the top ones right now. So the first one that you want to check, especially if it was working and now it's not, is make sure this little lever around the display button hasn't inadvertently been switched over to video, because that will that's a different set of controls. So we want to make sure that's on stills if we're shooting stills, and then it should work as you expect. Now, there are some other reasons though. So for example, one of the things I see happen is people will go to the wrong menu here, especially if they're kind of out in just this listed menu, not so much the category menu here. But if you're just kind of going through, it's very easy to accidentally go down to where it says custom controls. This looks innocent, right? This looks like the right place. We give this a click. The problem is this is for video. This is G2. We do not want G2 if we're doing stills. I mean, if you want to customize your buttons for video, this is where you do it. But if you're trying to shoot stills and you've customized one of your buttons in here, it's not going to work. What we need to do is go up to F2 if we want to do that stuff. And the problem is they look the same, right? So if we go in here, looks kind of the same as what we had with the video one. So it's very easy to make that mistake. And I've seen people make that on multiple occasions. So if you're trying to customize your buttons and you're doing it for stills, make sure you are doing it in F2. If you're in the wrong menu, your programming will work when you're in video, but it's not going to work when you're in stills. So that's the other reason there. Now, another place where people kind of get messed up here sometimes is with these custom setting banks. Now, I don't actually have multiple custom settings banks. I'm always in bank A. But if you have multiple banks and you've switched to one with a different setup for your controls, maybe that's why it's not working. Or more likely, if you're only using one bank and you've inadvertently ended up in like bank B or something and it's gone back to the camera defaults, maybe that's the problem too. So this is another place to check. But generally speaking, if the controls aren't acting the way you want, it's usually one of those issues. As a quick adjunct to this, also, if you're using something like a Z6, Z7 series, basically one of the other series that has the user modes, U1, U2, U3 on this little dial right here, keep in mind each one of those is a separate set of programming too. So you could have inadvertently ended up in one of the user modes. Let's say you were in manual and somehow it accidentally got over to user 3 and suddenly your buttons aren't working as you expect anymore. So that's another place to look, is to make sure that you haven't inadvertently gone into a user mode with a different set of settings. Although I program my control ring for a certain task, maybe ISO or exposure compensation, it doesn't seem to be working. What could be wrong? This is almost universally caused by programming function rings instead of control rings. Now, function rings are only available on two lenses right now, and that is the 600 TC and the 400 TC. No other lens has function rings, but they're in the menu. So when you try to program them for something and you expect it to work on something like this little 24 to 120, it doesn't happen because it doesn't have that feature. Let me show you what happens. It's very, very easy to make this mistake. We're going to go to Controls, and we're going to go to Custom Controls Shooting, and then we're just going to go down here to these function rings. Again, these are only found on the 400 TC and the 600 TC at the moment. And you can see when you're looking at the actual photo here, the actual picture here, it actually looks like a ring on there. It looks like a control ring, so it's a very easy mistake to make. However, the one you want is the one down here, which is the control ring. Make sure basically that it says control ring right here on your screen and not function ring. You want control ring. Try programming that, and I think it'll probably work for you. So there you have it. Those are the 12 most common problems people are asking me about and the solutions that usually work. And again, I just want to emphasize that all of these troubleshooting items that we've talked about here are covered in even more detail in my Z8 and Z9 setup guide, as well as the Z6 III wildlife setup guide. So make sure you check those out, because they don't only have problems and solutions, they're also just brimming with hundreds of tips, tricks, and techniques to help you get the most from that Z series camera. So make sure you check those out. I know you're going to love them. And if you learned something today, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. I'd love to have you as a subscriber. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.